A Little History of the United States.
This book tells the story of America from its earliest days to modern times in a way that is easy to understand. It covers key events, important figures, and the changes that shaped the country. In this summary, we will go through 7 major stages of American history. The first part will cover the years from 1607 to 1789, from the early English colonies to the founding of the United States. The second part will look at how the country expanded and grew from 1789 to 1860. The third part will focus on the Civil War and Reconstruction from 1861 to 1877. The fourth part will discuss the rise of industry and America's growing global power from 1877 to 1929. The fifth part will cover the Great Depression and World War II from 1929 to 1945. The sixth part will explore the recovery of post-war America and challenges and new directions in modern America from 1945 to 2015. Finally, the seventh part will examine the events and transformations that have shaped America from 2015 to 2025, exploring the most recent developments in American history. Each period is marked by struggles and transformations that influence the trajectory of the nation and shape the identity of its people.
Part 1. The Birth of a Nation. From Colonies to Independence.
America's history begins long before the first European settlers arrived. Native American tribes had lived on this land for thousands of years, building different cultures and ways of life. Some groups hunted animals, while others farmed the land. They had their own governments, religions, and traditions, forming civilizations as complex as those in Europe. But when European explorers set foot on this continent, everything began to change. Disease, war, and displacement severely affected the indigenous people, leading to a dramatic shift in the population and power dynamics. Many tribes were forced to abandon their lands, while others tried to resist colonial expansion, often leading to violent conflicts that continued for centuries. In the early 1600s, English settlers arrived in what is now Virginia. They built a small colony called Jamestown. Life there was extremely hard. Many settlers died from hunger and disease. But those who survived learned to grow tobacco, which became a valuable crop. Tobacco made some settlers rich, and more people from England came to join them. Around the same time, another group of settlers, the Pilgrims, landed in Massachusetts. They were different from the Jamestown settlers. They left England not to make money, but to practice their religion freely. These Pilgrims formed a colony called Plymouth, and later, more English settlers arrived, creating several other colonies along the East Coast. The harsh winters and unfamiliar land challenged these settlers, but with time, they adapted and built thriving communities. Many relied on help from Native Americans to survive in the early years, though relations between settlers and indigenous tribes often became tense and hostile as colonists demanded more land. At first, the English colonies struggled, but over time, they grew stronger. They traded with Native Americans, though not always peacefully. Conflicts often broke out as settlers took more land. The colonies also needed more workers, and sadly, many of them turned to slavery. Ships brought thousands of enslaved people from Africa to work on plantations. This cruel system lasted for over 200 years and became a major part of the economy in the southern colonies, where crops like tobacco, cotton, and sugar required large amounts of labor. The enslaved people were treated as property, forced to work under brutal conditions, and denied basic human rights. The institution of slavery shaped social and economic systems in the colonies, creating divisions that would persist for generations and ultimately lead to national conflict. By the 1700s, 13 English colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast. Each colony had its own government, but they all answered to the British king. Over time, the colonists began to feel frustrated. They worked hard, but British laws and taxes controlled their lives. One of the biggest problems was taxation. Britain made the colonists pay taxes on goods like tea and paper, but they had no representatives in the British Parliament to speak for them. Many colonists thought this was unfair. They began protesting, saying, "No taxation without representation." Resentment grew, and secret groups like the Sons of Liberty formed, spreading the message of resistance and urging action against British rule. Many boycotted British goods and held public demonstrations, demanding their rights as English citizens. Tensions grew, and in 1773, something big happened in Boston. A group of colonists, angry about a new tea tax, dressed up as Native Americans and dumped British tea into the harbor. This event, known as the Boston Tea Party, shocked the British government. In response, the British sent more troops to control the colonies. The situation kept getting worse, and by 1775, fighting broke out between British soldiers and colonial militias. This was the beginning of the American Revolution. The Revolution was not only a war for independence, but also a battle over the meaning of freedom and self-governance. At first, it seemed impossible for the colonists to win. Britain was one of the most powerful countries in the world, with a huge army and navy. The American militias were smaller and not well trained. But the colonists had something powerful on their side: the desire for freedom. In 1776, leaders from the colonies met and wrote the Declaration of Independence, a document that explained why they were breaking away from Britain. Thomas Jefferson, the main writer, declared that all men are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This idea became the foundation of the new country. The document inspired people not only in America, but around the world, as it expressed ideas of democracy and human rights that challenged traditional systems of power. The war lasted for several years. The Americans suffered many defeats, but they kept fighting. They received help from France, which sent soldiers, ships, and money. After an important victory in Yorktown in 1781, Britain finally surrendered. 2 years later, the war officially ended, and the United States of America was born. However, independence was just the first step. The country still needed to figure out how to govern itself and unite 13 different states under one system. Now, the new country faced a big challenge: how to govern itself. At first, the states were loosely connected, each making its own decisions. But this system was weak. The leaders realized they needed a stronger national government. In 1787, they wrote the U.S. Constitution, creating a government with 3 branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial. This system balanced power so that no single person or group could control everything. The Constitution also included a Bill of Rights, which protected basic freedoms like speech and religion. These rights would become the backbone of American democracy, ensuring that citizens had protections against government overreach and tyranny. By 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States. The country was still small, but it had taken its first steps toward becoming a new kind of nation, one founded on the idea of freedom and self-government. However, many challenges lay ahead. Conflicts with Native Americans continued as settlers moved west, leading to violent clashes and forced removals. Slavery, though ignored in the Constitution, remained a painful issue that would eventually divide the country. And while independence was a great victory, America's place in the world was still uncertain. The nation's journey had only just begun, and the coming years would test whether its founding ideals could truly be upheld.
Part 2. Expanding a Nation. From Revolution to Growth.
After the United States gained its independence, it was time to focus on building a new nation. The years between 1789 and 1860 were critical in shaping the future of the United States. During this period, the country expanded both in size and in its ability to govern itself. The first few decades were difficult, but they set the foundation for the nation's growth. The new nation was struggling to define itself, yet it was a time when America began its transformation from a collection of former British colonies to a vast, diverse, and growing country with its own identity. In 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States. As the leader of the new country, Washington faced the enormous task of guiding a nation that was still very young and unsure of its future. The United States needed a stable government, and that came with the creation of the U.S. Constitution, which had been written in 1787 but only went into effect 2 years later. The Constitution established the framework for the government, dividing power between the President, Congress, and the courts. This system of checks and balances ensured that no one branch of government would become too powerful. This was a major step forward, as it created a solid foundation for the new country to grow on. However, the Constitution did not address some of the country's biggest challenges. Slavery was one such issue. While the Constitution allowed for slavery to continue in certain states, many Americans believed that it was morally wrong. Abolitionists, or those who wanted to end slavery, began to speak out and work toward freeing enslaved people. But despite the growing calls for change, slavery continued to thrive, especially in the southern states, where it was deeply tied to the economy. The moral and economic divides between the North and South over slavery would only deepen as the country expanded westward. The 19th century also saw the United States begin to expand westward. One of the most significant events during this period was the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. President Thomas Jefferson bought a vast area of land from France, which doubled the size of the United States. This opened up new opportunities for settlement and exploration. With this purchase, the United States gained control of a large part of the North American continent, including much of the land that would become the states of Louisiana, Missouri, and Kansas. As settlers moved west, they began to carve out new towns and territories, and the push to populate these areas grew stronger. The westward expansion had its price. As settlers moved westward, they often clashed with Native American tribes who had lived in these lands for centuries. The tribes were forced to give up their land, and many were relocated to reservations. This led to violent clashes, and many Native Americans died as a result of these forced moves, as well as disease and exposure. As more people moved west, the idea of manifest destiny took hold. This belief held that it was the United States' mission to expand across the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This idea led to the annexation of Texas in 1845, a move that upset many in Mexico and led to the Mexican-American War. The war lasted from 1846 to 1848, and after the United States won, it gained vast new territories, including present-day California, Arizona, and New Mexico. This expansion would lay the groundwork for future disputes over the issue of slavery, as the new territories needed to decide whether they would allow slavery. As the country expanded westward, tensions between the North and South over slavery intensified. The North was becoming more industrialized, and its economy was based on manufacturing, trade, and a growing workforce of free laborers. The South, on the other hand, remained largely agricultural, relying on slave labor to work on its cotton, tobacco, and sugar plantations. This difference in economies and lifestyles created deep divisions between the two regions. The North pushed for the abolition of slavery, while the South saw it as vital to its way of life and economic success. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act was passed, which allowed the government to force Native American tribes living in the southeastern United States to move to lands west of the Mississippi River. The government argued that this would allow for greater economic expansion and settlement of the region. The most famous example of this forced relocation is the Trail of Tears. Thousands of Cherokee people were forced to march to land that was deemed unsuitable for settlement, leading to the deaths of many along the way. This event is considered one of the darkest moments in American history. At the same time, the economy of the United States was changing. The North became more industrialized, with factories producing goods like textiles, tools, and machinery. This shift in the economy led to the growth of cities, as people moved from rural areas to work in factories. Many immigrants from Europe came to the United States during this period, hoping to escape poverty and find better opportunities. These new arrivals, combined with the movement from the countryside to the cities, helped create a rapidly growing urban population. This period of industrialization also saw the rise of labor movements, as workers began to demand better wages and working conditions. In contrast, the South remained largely agricultural, with a growing dependence on the labor of enslaved people to produce cotton and other crops. The Southern economy was more traditional, relying on large plantations to produce the goods that were in demand worldwide. This economic system became more entrenched over time, with laws and social structures designed to protect the institution of slavery. The North, with its growing urban population and industrial economy, increasingly viewed slavery as morally and economically outdated. This difference in perspectives between the North and South would become one of the primary causes of the Civil War. As the United States continued to expand, the question of how to incorporate new territories into the Union became a major source of tension. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise was passed, which allowed Missouri to join the Union as a slave state, but also set a geographic boundary, above which slavery would be prohibited. This compromise temporarily settled the issue, but it would come up again and again as new territories were added to the United States. The debate over slavery reached its peak in the 1850s. The Compromise of 1850 was another attempt to ease tensions between the North and South, but it only postponed the inevitable conflict. It allowed California to join the Union as a free state, but it also introduced the Fugitive Slave Act, which required runaway slaves to be returned to their owners. This law angered many in the North, and it fueled the growing abolitionist movement. By the time Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, the country was on the brink of civil war. Lincoln's election was seen as a threat by many in the South, as he was opposed to the expansion of slavery into new territories. As a result, several Southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. This action would lead to the outbreak of the Civil War just a few months later. In conclusion, the years from 1789 to 1860 were a time of rapid expansion, political change, and growing tensions in the United States. The country went from a collection of newly independent states to a powerful and growing nation. But the contradictions within the country, particularly over the issue of slavery, created deep divisions that would soon lead to one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history, the Civil War.
Part 3. The Civil War and Reconstruction.
The period from 1861 to 1877 was one of the most turbulent and defining eras in American history. This chapter of the nation's past centers around the Civil War and the Reconstruction that followed. The Civil War, which began in 1861, was a result of deep divisions between the northern and southern states, primarily over the issues of slavery and states' rights. The South's economy heavily relied on slavery, especially in agriculture, while the North had largely abolished slavery and was more industrialized. This stark difference in economies and social structures created growing tension between the two regions. The war officially started in April 1861 when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. This event triggered a full-scale war between the Union, the northern states, and the Confederacy, the southern states. The Confederacy was made up of 11 southern states that seceded from the Union, seeking to preserve slavery and their way of life. The Confederacy's new president, Jefferson Davis, argued that the South had the right to govern itself and maintain its traditional economic system, which included slavery. In the early stages of the war, the Union was initially caught off guard by the strength and determination of the Confederate Army. The Confederacy had a strong military leadership under General Robert E. Lee, and many Southern soldiers were highly motivated to protect their homes and families. The Union, however, had a much larger population, greater industrial capacity, and a superior navy. Despite these advantages, the Union Army faced early defeats, and the war dragged on longer than many had anticipated. The war was brutal, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Some of the most famous battles include Gettysburg, Antietam, and Bull Run. These battles showed the fierce determination of both sides, but they also highlighted the immense human cost of the conflict. The Union, led by President Abraham Lincoln, was fighting to preserve the nation, while the Confederacy, led by General Robert E. Lee, was fighting to defend their rights to self-government and slavery. The war was marked by bloody and devastating battles, and both armies faced immense losses. The war reached a turning point in 1863, with the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the bloodiest and most decisive confrontations of the conflict. The Union victory at Gettysburg, combined with the fall of Vicksburg, gave the Union hope that they could win the war. After this point, the Confederacy began to lose ground, and the Union started to adopt a strategy of total war, targeting not only the Confederate Army, but also the resources that supported it. The Union's victory at Gettysburg was crucial in stopping the momentum of the Confederate Army and ensuring that the war would be won by the North. One of the most important developments in the war came in 1863 with President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. This executive order declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territories were free. While it did not immediately free all slaves, it changed the nature of the war. The war was no longer just about preserving the Union, but also about ending the brutal system of slavery. The proclamation also allowed African Americans to enlist in the Union Army, giving them an active role in the fight for freedom. Over 180,000 African Americans served in the Union Army and Navy, showing their dedication to ending slavery and securing their own freedom. As the war continued, the economic and social strain on both the Union and the Confederacy intensified. The North's industrial economy was better equipped to handle the demands of the war, while the South, with its agricultural economy, found itself running low on supplies. The Confederate economy was further weakened by a blockade of its ports, which prevented it from trading with foreign nations. In addition, the South's reliance on slavery for labor created a situation where their ability to sustain the war effort became increasingly difficult. The Union began to gain momentum, and by 1865, the Confederacy was weakening. With the help of French and Spanish allies, the Union forces finally surrounded the Confederate Army in Virginia. The Confederate forces, exhausted and overwhelmed, surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. The Civil War was officially over, but the damage had been done, and the nation's wounds were deep. The aftermath of the Civil War left the nation deeply divided. Although the Union had been preserved, the question of slavery had not been completely resolved. More than 4 million African Americans had been enslaved, and their freedom had been won. But how to integrate them into society was a challenge that the country would struggle with for many years. The Southern states, devastated by the war, faced the difficult task of rebuilding their economies and infrastructure. The question of whether former slaves would be able to enjoy full equality under the law became a major issue in the post-war years. This led to the period known as Reconstruction, which lasted from 1865 to 1877. President Lincoln had been assassinated in 1865, just days after the war ended, and his successor, Andrew Johnson, faced the difficult task of bringing the Southern states back into the Union. Johnson, a Southern Democrat, took a lenient approach to Reconstruction, offering pardons to many former Confederate leaders and allowing Southern states to rejoin the Union with few restrictions. His plan aimed to quickly restore the Union and rebuild the South, but it angered many in the North who felt the South should be held accountable for its actions during the war. During Reconstruction, Congress passed several important laws aimed at ensuring the rights of newly freed African Americans. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, abolished slavery in the United States, making it illegal to own slaves anywhere in the country. The 14th Amendment, passed in 1868, granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to all people born or naturalized in the U.S., including former slaves. The 15th Amendment, passed in 1870, granted voting rights to African American men. These legal advancements marked a significant shift in the country's understanding of equality and human rights. Despite these advancements, Reconstruction faced fierce opposition from white Southerners, many of whom were unwilling to accept the changes. In the South, discriminatory laws known as black codes were passed to restrict the rights of African Americans, and white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan used violence and intimidation to prevent African Americans from exercising their new rights. The Klan targeted African American voters, politicians, and anyone who supported Reconstruction efforts. This violent resistance threatened to undo the progress that had been made. Meanwhile, many Northern Republicans began to lose faith in Reconstruction. Economic struggles, corruption scandals, and a lack of progress in the South led to a decline in support for Reconstruction policies. The national mood shifted, and by 1877, after a contested election, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. The South regained control of its own affairs, and many of the rights gained by African Americans during Reconstruction were slowly stripped away. This period of redemption, as it was called, saw the rise of Jim Crow laws, which enforced racial segregation and disenfranchised African Americans. Although Reconstruction failed to achieve full equality for African Americans, it set the stage for the civil rights movement nearly a century later. The end of slavery and the legal advancements made during this period were important milestones in the long struggle for civil rights in the United States. The lessons learned during this time shaped the nation's future, reminding people that true equality required more than just legal changes. It required a shift in attitudes, a commitment to justice, and an unwavering belief in the principles of freedom and equality for all.
Part 4. The Rise of Industry and America's Growing Power.
The period between 1877 and 1929 was a time of great transformation for the United States. During these years, the country underwent significant changes in its economy, society, and role in the world. This era is often referred to as the Gilded Age because on the surface, the country seemed rich and successful. But underneath the surface, there were deep social and economic issues that would have lasting effects. The wealth that many Americans enjoyed during this time was not spread equally, and the rapid growth of industry and urbanization came with serious challenges. In the late 1800s, the United States became one of the most industrialized nations in the world. Before this time, the country had mostly been an agricultural society, with many people working on farms. But with the rise of factories and machines, this began to change. Railroads played a huge role in this transformation, connecting cities and regions and allowing goods to be transported more quickly and efficiently. The expansion of the railroad network opened up new markets for goods, allowing businesses to sell products across the country. The steel industry also boomed during this time, and cities like Pittsburgh became famous for their factories and steel mills. The rapid growth of industry created a huge demand for labor. Immigrants from Europe flooded into the country, seeking better opportunities. Between 1870 and 1920, over 20 million immigrants arrived in the United States, many of them settling in cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston. These new arrivals provided the labor force needed to fuel the rapid industrialization. They worked in factories, mines, and on railroads, often under harsh conditions. The work was long, dangerous, and poorly paid, and workers had few protections. Many children were also employed in factories, contributing to the growing problem of child labor. Living conditions for factory workers were often poor, with families crowded into small apartments in quickly growing cities. These neighborhoods, known as slums, lacked sanitation, and disease spread easily. The wealth created by this industrial boom was not shared equally. While some businessmen, like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, became incredibly rich, many workers lived in poverty. These business owners, known as robber barons, used their wealth and power to control entire industries, often at the expense of their workers. Carnegie's steel empire and Rockefeller's oil monopoly allowed them to accumulate vast fortunes. But while the richest Americans became more powerful, many workers suffered. They worked long hours for low wages, and their living conditions were harsh. In response, many workers began to organize and fight for their rights. Labor unions were formed, and workers demanded better pay, shorter working hours, and safer working conditions. The rise of unions led to significant strikes, such as the Pullman Strike of 1894, where railroad workers protested against wage cuts and high rents in company-owned towns. During this time, the United States also began to expand its influence in the world. The country's economy was growing, and it wanted to protect its new industries and markets. In 1898, the United States became involved in the Spanish-American War. This conflict marked a turning point in American foreign policy. The war began as a response to Spain's harsh treatment of Cuba, which was seeking independence. But it quickly grew to involve other territories. In the war, the United States defeated Spain and gained control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. This marked the beginning of America's involvement in global affairs. The acquisition of these territories was part of a broader movement known as imperialism, where the United States began to exert control over other nations, believing it had the right and responsibility to spread democracy and capitalism. While the Industrial Revolution and imperialism brought wealth to some, they also brought significant social challenges. The rapid growth of cities led to overcrowding, which in turn caused poor living conditions for many people. The rise of large corporations created monopolies, where one company controlled an entire industry, stifling competition and innovation. The government began to intervene more in the economy, passing laws to regulate businesses and protect consumers. In the early 1900s, President Theodore Roosevelt pushed for reforms to regulate businesses and protect workers. He believed in a square deal, where the government would balance the interests of workers, businesses, and consumers. He was particularly focused on breaking up monopolies and ensuring that no company could dominate an entire industry. The Progressive Era, which lasted from the 1890s to the 1920s, was a time of social and political reform. During this period, many Americans worked to improve society by addressing issues like child labor, women's rights, and the corrupt political system. The progressives sought to make the government more responsive to the needs of the people and to reduce the power of big business. They fought for laws that would regulate working conditions, improve education, and promote public health. One of the most important achievements of this era was the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which granted women the right to vote. This was the culmination of decades of work by women's suffrage activists who fought for women's political rights. At the same time, the United States was facing new challenges abroad. The country's involvement in World War I, which began in 1914 and ended in 1918, tested its role on the world stage. Although the United States initially stayed out of the conflict, it eventually entered the war in 1917. The war had a huge impact on the country. Many soldiers went overseas to fight, and the war effort brought about new industries and technological innovations. The war also led to significant changes in American society, including a greater role for women in the workforce and the beginning of the civil rights movement for African Americans. The war was a turning point for many people, as it created a sense of shared national purpose and pride. However, it also exposed deep racial and social divides that would continue to challenge the country for many years to come. After World War I ended, the United States entered a period of economic prosperity known as the Roaring Twenties. During this time, the economy grew rapidly, and the country became a global leader in industry and culture. New technologies, like the automobile and the radio, transformed daily life. The Ford Model T, for example, made cars affordable for many Americans and changed the way people lived. With the rise of consumer culture, people began to buy more goods and services than ever before. The mass production of goods allowed for lower prices, making items like radios, household appliances, and clothes available to a wider audience. This period also saw the rise of jazz music, Hollywood films, and other cultural innovations, making the United States a global center of entertainment and creativity. However, this period of prosperity was not without its problems. While some Americans were thriving, many others were left behind. The wealth of the 1920s was concentrated in the hands of a few, and there was a growing gap between the rich and the poor. The agricultural sector, which had been a major part of the economy, was struggling. Farmers faced falling crop prices and debt, and many were forced to leave their land. This imbalance would eventually lead to the Great Depression, but the problems that contributed to the collapse of the economy were already beginning to show during the 1920s. By the end of the 1920s, the United States had undergone a dramatic transformation. It had become an industrial powerhouse, a global military power, and a cultural leader. But beneath this success, there were signs of social and economic problems that would soon lead to one of the greatest crises in American history, the Great Depression.
Part 5. The Great Depression and World War II.
The years from 1929 to 1945 were some of the most difficult and defining moments in American history. These years were marked by the Great Depression, a period of widespread economic hardship, and World War II, which would change the world and America forever. The United States, which had enjoyed a period of prosperity in the 1920s, was suddenly thrown into crisis, and it would take the nation years to recover. However, these struggles also led to major political, social, and economic changes that shaped the future of the country. The Great Depression began in 1929, when the stock market in the United States crashed. The crash sent shockwaves through the economy, causing businesses to fail, banks to close, and millions of people to lose their jobs. It was the worst economic downturn in American history. The economy contracted, and unemployment rates soared. By 1933, about 1/4 of the American workforce was unemployed, and many people lost their homes. Families struggled to survive as they faced poverty and hunger. Farmers, who had already been facing difficulties, were hit especially hard. The Dust Bowl, a series of severe droughts, devastated crops in the Midwest, further worsening the situation for many families. The Great Depression affected all aspects of life in America. The banking system was severely weakened, and many banks failed, causing people to lose their savings. The stock market crash was followed by a wave of bankruptcies as companies went out of business and people lost their jobs. The unemployment rate reached 25%, and many people were forced to rely on government assistance to survive. Homelessness became a widespread issue, and Hoovervilles, shanty towns named after President Herbert Hoover, appeared in cities across the country. These makeshift communities were built by homeless families who had lost everything during the Depression. President Herbert Hoover, who was in office when the Great Depression began, struggled to respond to the crisis. He believed that the government should not interfere too much in the economy and hoped that the market would eventually recover on its own. However, his policies were largely ineffective, and public frustration with him grew. Many Americans felt that Hoover had failed to address the needs of the people. And in the 1932 presidential election, they elected Franklin D. Roosevelt, hoping for change. Roosevelt, known as FDR, promised to bring the country out of the Depression with a series of bold programs known as the New Deal. The New Deal aimed to provide relief for the unemployed, recover the economy, and reform the financial system to prevent future depressions. One of the first actions Roosevelt took was to declare a bank holiday, closing all banks for a few days to prevent further panic and to allow the government to inspect their finances. He then passed a series of laws that created programs to provide jobs, support farmers, and regulate businesses. Among the most significant initiatives of the New Deal was the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, which employed young men to work on environmental projects, such as building national parks and planting trees. The Public Works Administration, PWA, and the Works Progress Administration, WPA, also created jobs by funding large public infrastructure projects, including the construction of bridges, schools, and roads. These programs helped to reduce unemployment and improve the country's infrastructure. Another important part of the New Deal, the Social Security Act of 1935, created a social safety net for the elderly, disabled, and unemployed, ensuring that Americans would have some financial security during times of need. Despite these efforts, the New Deal did not fully resolve the Great Depression. The economy began to recover slowly, but it wasn't until the United States entered World War II that the country fully emerged from the economic crisis. The war effort created millions of jobs, and factories that had been idle during the Depression were now producing weapons, uniforms, and other supplies for the military. The war also brought about a significant change in the workforce, especially for women and minorities. In 1941, the United States entered World War II after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, a U.S. naval base in Hawaii. The attack, which killed over 2,000 Americans, led to the United States declaring war on Japan, and shortly after, on Germany and Italy. The United States quickly mobilized its military forces, and the war effort provided a major boost to the economy. Factories began to produce goods for the war, and millions of men and women enlisted in the military or took jobs in factories, shipyards, and other industries. With the U.S. entering the war, it formed alliances with the Allied powers, including the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and other nations fighting against the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. The war took place on multiple fronts. In Europe, the Allies fought the German military, which had invaded much of the continent. In the Pacific, the United States fought Japan, which had expanded its territory across East Asia and the Pacific Islands. The war was long, brutal, and required massive resources. It also marked a turning point for the United States, as it transitioned from being a nation focused on internal issues to becoming a global superpower. World War II had a profound impact on American society. The war created new opportunities for women and minorities, who had previously been excluded from many jobs. As men went off to fight in the war, women were called upon to take over jobs in factories, offices, and other sectors. This was the beginning of a major shift in gender roles, as women entered the workforce in large numbers. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, a symbol of female workers in the war, became an emblem of women's contributions to the war effort. Women not only worked in manufacturing, but also served in military support roles, such as nurses and secretaries. The war also had a significant impact on African Americans. Many African American men served in the military, and thousands more found work in war industries. However, racial discrimination remained widespread, and African American soldiers were often segregated from white soldiers. Despite these challenges, the war helped lay the groundwork for the civil rights movement, as African Americans began to demand equality and better treatment both during and after the war. By the end of the war, the American economy was booming. The U.S. had emerged as the world's leading economic and military power. The war effort had led to a massive industrial expansion, and the government played an active role in directing and supporting war production. Unemployment rates dropped significantly, and wages increased. The economic recovery of the 1940s laid the foundation for the prosperity of the 1950s. During the war, the American government had invested heavily in industrial production and technological advancements. The military needed advanced equipment, and civilian industries switched to producing war materials. This expansion created a strong economic base and helped the United States transition from an isolated economy to one that played a significant role in global trade. The war also spurred technological advances, such as the development of radar, jet engines, and nuclear weapons. By the end of World War II, the United States had emerged as one of the world's two superpowers, alongside the Soviet Union. This marked the beginning of the Cold War, a period of tension and rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union that would last for several decades. The end of the war also marked the beginning of a new era in American history. The United States became a global leader in politics, economics, and culture, and the post-war years were characterized by prosperity and growth. The war had reshaped American society and economy, and the country's role in the world would never be the same.
Part 6. Post-War America. Recovery, Challenges, and New Directions.
Following the devastation of World War II, the United States found itself in a new position on the world stage. The war had left much of Europe and Asia in ruins, but the U.S. economy had grown stronger, thanks to its industrial production and wartime efforts. By the late 1940s, America was not only the leading economic power, but also the most influential political force globally. During this time, the United States became embroiled in the Cold War, a geopolitical struggle against the Soviet Union. This ideological conflict shaped much of American foreign policy for the next several decades. The Cold War led to events such as the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, which ended in an uneasy truce, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Throughout this period, the U.S. sought to prevent the spread of communism, which it saw as a direct threat to its democratic and capitalist values. The U.S. also supported a variety of military and political interventions across the globe, particularly in Latin America and Southeast Asia, to counter the influence of the Soviet Union and prevent the spread of communism. While tensions remained high internationally, the post-war years also saw significant change within the U.S. itself. The 1950s were a time of relative peace and prosperity, and many Americans enjoyed an expanding economy, rising wages, and a growing middle class. This period also saw the rise of consumer culture, with new technologies like television becoming central to daily life. However, this prosperity was not shared equally. African Americans in the South still faced segregation, while many other minorities struggled with discrimination. This inequality led to the rise of the Civil Rights Movement, which sought to dismantle racial segregation and ensure equal rights for all Americans, regardless of race. In the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement gained momentum. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X became symbols of resistance against racial injustice. The movement led to landmark legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These laws aimed to eliminate segregation and protect voting rights for African Americans, marking a turning point in American society. The success of the movement also inspired other social movements, including the women's rights movement and the LGBTQ+ rights movement. However, the struggle for equality continued. The feminist movement, which had roots in the early 20th century, gained strength during the 1960s and 1970s. Women began to demand equal rights, including access to education, fair pay, and reproductive rights. The push for gender equality was part of a broader shift in societal values as more Americans questioned traditional roles and expectations. The growing awareness of issues related to gender and sexuality helped to bring marginalized voices into the political conversation, contributing to the broader changes in American society. The Vietnam War, which began in the 1950s but escalated in the 1960s and early 1970s, was another defining event of this period. Initially, the U.S. government framed its involvement as part of the global effort to stop the spread of communism. However, the war became increasingly unpopular as it dragged on, resulting in widespread protests across the nation. The war's brutal nature and its failure to bring about a clear victory led to a deep sense of disillusionment, particularly among young people. The United States withdrew from Vietnam in 1973, but the war left a lasting impact on both the U.S. and Vietnam. The war also highlighted the growing divisions within American society, as many questioned the morality of the conflict and the government's decisions. The 1970s were marked by economic struggles. The country faced high inflation and rising oil prices, leading to what became known as stagflation, a combination of stagnant economic growth and high inflation. The oil embargo imposed by OPEC in 1973 caused fuel prices to soar, and many Americans experienced long lines at gas stations. These economic difficulties, coupled with political scandals like Watergate, led to a decline in trust in government. In 1974, President Richard Nixon became the first U.S. president to resign after the Watergate scandal, a political scandal that involved a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters and subsequent cover-up by the Nixon administration. Nixon's resignation signaled the end of an era, leaving many Americans questioning the integrity of their political institutions. Despite these challenges, the 1980s marked a period of significant change. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president, ushering in a new era of conservative politics. Reagan's policies, known as Reaganomics, focused on reducing the size of government, cutting taxes, and promoting free market capitalism. Reagan's economic policies aimed to reduce the government's role in the economy, favoring instead a system of private enterprise and deregulation. Supporters argued that these policies would stimulate economic growth, but critics pointed to the rising income inequality and the concentration of wealth among the richest Americans. Reagan's presidency also saw an increase in military spending and a hardline stance against the Soviet Union, contributing to the later collapse of the Soviet bloc in 1989. His policies and leadership style transformed the political landscape, setting the stage for future political shifts. The 1980s were also a time of significant social change. The feminist movement continued to push for gender equality, and LGBTQ rights began to gain visibility, particularly with the AIDS crisis, which drew attention to the struggles of the gay community. In response to the AIDS epidemic, activists began pushing for greater government intervention and awareness, as the disease disproportionately affected the LGBTQ+ population. While progress was being made in some areas, racial inequality remained a persistent issue. The 1980s and 1990s saw growing efforts to address racial disparities in education, housing, and employment, though challenges remained. The 1990s were a period of economic growth and technological innovation. The end of the Cold War in 1991, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, marked a new chapter in global relations. The U.S. emerged as the world's sole superpower, and the economy flourished with the rise of the internet and information technology. The 1990s saw the rapid expansion of personal computers, the internet, and mobile phones, which transformed the way people lived, worked, and communicated. The proliferation of these technologies had a lasting effect on American culture and society, opening new avenues for economic development and global connectivity. Domestically, the 1990s also saw the rise of a more conservative political movement. In 1994, the Republican Party, under Newt Gingrich, gained control of Congress for the first time in decades. Gingrich's Contract with America promised to reduce government spending, cut taxes, and promote family values. President Bill Clinton, who took office in 1993, faced both cooperation and conflict with the Republican-controlled Congress. Clinton's presidency was marked by economic prosperity and a budget surplus, but his time in office was also marred by the Monica Lewinsky scandal, which led to his impeachment by the House of Representatives in 1998. Clinton was acquitted by the Senate, but the scandal nonetheless overshadowed much of his second term. The 2000s began with a period of uncertainty. In 2000, the presidential election between George W. Bush and Al Gore ended in a controversial and narrow decision, with the Supreme Court ultimately declaring Bush the winner after a disputed recount in Florida. This contentious election set the tone for a presidency that would face unprecedented challenges. On September 11, 2001, the United States was attacked by the terrorist group Al-Qaeda. The attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. killed nearly 3,000 people and shocked the nation. In response, the U.S. launched the War on Terror, which included the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003. These wars became long, costly conflicts, with the U.S. facing growing opposition both domestically and internationally. The impact of these wars, coupled with a weakening economy, led to a major shift in American political attitudes, especially regarding foreign interventions. The economic consequences of these wars were felt throughout the 2000s. The housing bubble of the mid-2000s, fueled by risky lending practices and the growth of the subprime mortgage market, eventually led to the financial crisis of 2007-2008. The collapse of major financial institutions, the bailout of the banking sector, and widespread unemployment left millions of Americans struggling. The financial crisis revealed serious flaws in the financial system and led to a national debate over regulation and corporate responsibility. As the 2010s began, the U.S. faced both ongoing challenges and new opportunities. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 marked a historic moment as he became the first African-American president. Obama's presidency focused on economic recovery, healthcare reform, and foreign relations, including the killing of Osama bin Laden in 2011. Despite early successes, Obama's presidency was also marked by deep political division and partisan gridlock as Congress struggled to pass key legislation. His administration's push for healthcare reform, culminating in the Affordable Care Act, commonly known as Obamacare, was one of the defining achievements of his presidency, but also sparked heated debate across the political spectrum.
Part 7. Beyond the book, a look at the last decade.
Since the publication of the book in 2015, the world has undergone significant changes, especially in the United States. The past decade has been marked by political upheaval, social movements, economic challenges, and a global health crisis. In this section, we will explore the key events and transformations in American history from 2015 to 2025, focusing on how these developments have shaped the nation's course. One of the most significant events of the last decade was the election of Donald Trump as president in 2016. Trump's victory was a major political shock as he defeated Hillary Clinton, the Democratic nominee, in a highly contested election. His win marked a stark break from the previous administration and ushered in a period of intense political polarization. A businessman and television personality with no prior political experience, Trump's election was a statement about the discontent many Americans felt toward the political establishment. Trump's policies were often controversial, and his approach to leadership was unconventional. One of his most notable achievements was the tax reform bill, which reduced corporate taxes in an attempt to stimulate economic growth. However, critics argued that the tax cuts primarily benefited the wealthiest Americans, leaving many of the country's working-class citizens with little to show for it. Additionally, Trump focused heavily on immigration reform, attempting to build a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border to curb illegal immigration. His policies on immigration were often criticized for being harsh and discriminatory, with many questioning their humanitarian impact. On the international stage, Trump's America First policy led to the United States withdrawing from several major international agreements, such as the Paris Climate Agreement and the Iran nuclear deal. He also engaged in a trade war with China, imposing tariffs on Chinese goods and threatening further economic retaliation. These moves created tension with other countries and raised concerns about the future of global cooperation. While his supporters praised his tough stance on national security and trade, these policies left the country isolated from its global allies and, in some cases, economically strained. Amid all this, the country faced an unprecedented challenge: the COVID-19 pandemic. The virus, which originated in China, spread rapidly across the globe in early 2020. The United States became one of the hardest-hit countries, with the virus infecting millions and causing the deaths of over 200,000 people by the end of that year. The pandemic forced widespread shutdowns of businesses, schools, and government offices, leaving Americans in a state of uncertainty. The government's response, including lockdowns and the distribution of stimulus checks, was crucial to mitigate the economic damage. However, the social and economic repercussions were far-reaching, with unemployment rates soaring and millions of Americans struggling to make ends meet. The pandemic also highlighted significant inequalities in American society, particularly among minority communities. African Americans and Hispanics were disproportionately affected, not only in terms of health outcomes, but also due to the economic shutdowns. Essential workers, many of whom were minorities, faced dangerous working conditions in industries such as healthcare, retail, and transportation. These disparities fueled the Black Lives Matter movement, which gained further momentum after the tragic killing of George Floyd by a police officer in Minneapolis. This event sparked widespread protests and calls for racial justice and police reform. The demands for social justice during this time were met with varying degrees of support and resistance, both from the government and the public. As the pandemic unfolded, the 2020 presidential election became a critical moment in American history. Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate, won the election, defeating the incumbent Donald Trump. Biden's victory was seen as a rejection of Trump's leadership and an attempt to return to a more traditional political style. The election, which saw record voter turnout despite the pandemic, was a sign that Americans were eager for change. Biden's promises of unity and hope resonated with many voters, who were exhausted by the divisiveness and turbulence of Trump's presidency. However, Biden's tenure has not been without challenges. His administration has faced continued debate over issues like healthcare, climate change, and racial inequality. Additionally, his response to the pandemic, while more grounded in science than Trump's, has been scrutinized, particularly regarding vaccine distribution and the management of public health. As the nation entered 2021, it was clear that the effects of the pandemic were far from over. In January 2021, just days before Biden's inauguration, the United States witnessed an unprecedented attack on its government. On January 6th, a violent mob of Trump supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol in an attempt to overturn the results of the 2020 election. This event, known as the Capitol Insurrection, shocked the nation and highlighted the deep divisions within American society. In the aftermath, Trump was impeached for a second time, becoming the first U.S. president to be impeached twice, though he was acquitted again by the Senate. The insurrection revealed the extent to which Trump's rhetoric had fueled distrust in the democratic process, and it left a lasting scar on American political life. Despite these challenges, Trump's influence in the Republican Party remained strong. His supporters, many of whom believed the 2020 election had been stolen from him, rallied behind him once more. The appeal of his Make America Great Again, MAGA, movement seemed to only grow stronger, especially as economic frustrations, political disillusionment, and ongoing cultural battles created fertile ground for populism. Trump's impact on American politics was far from over, even after leaving office. Looking ahead to 2024, it became clear that Trump was preparing for another presidential run. His rise again was a result of a variety of factors, including growing discontent with Biden's handling of the economy, inflation, and other domestic issues. The United States, struggling with rising costs of living, had seen its economic recovery from the pandemic falter. This allowed Trump to capitalize on his image as a political outsider and populist leader who would fight for the working class. His aggressive rhetoric, including support for tariffs on China and skepticism toward globalism, resonated with many voters in Middle America. Despite all the controversy and political division, Trump's message of economic nationalism and anti-immigration policies found a significant portion of the population that was eager for change. His popularity, particularly among rural voters and working-class communities, gave him a real chance at regaining the presidency in 2024. The ongoing debates over economic recovery, national security, and the future of American democracy promise to make the election a critical moment for the country's future direction. As Trump eyed a return to the White House, it was crucial to consider the possible effects of his policies on the U.S. and the world. The trade wars, particularly with China, had already created significant disruptions to global supply chains. How would Trump's trade policies shape the U.S. economy in the long term? And how would his approach to the growing global challenges, such as the war in Ukraine, affect America's place on the world stage? Trump's leadership was marked by unpredictability, and his policies, ranging from tariffs to his stance on international cooperation, would continue to influence the nation's course. As America moves forward, the impact of Trump's presidency and his return to office will continue to shape political and social discourse. The next few years will likely bring continued debate about the role of government in addressing inequality, the future of the American economy, and the country's relationships with other global powers. In conclusion, as the United States enters the next phase of its history, questions about leadership, unity, and the direction of the country are more pressing than ever. Whether the U.S. continues along the path set by Trump and his policies, or whether a new direction emerges under different leadership, remains to be seen. What is certain, however, is that the political landscape will continue to evolve, and the choices made in the coming years will define the nation's future.